Today, we're going to talk about a story where a tenant turned down $20,000 for a cash for keys deal. We can go through some of the ups and downs and a bit of a roller coaster ride of selling a tenanted property in the Toronto area. My name is John Pasalis, president at Realosophy Realty. As always, if you're looking at buying, selling, or investing in the Toronto area, you can click the link below in the show notes to meet up with me and one of my agents. And that's exactly how this video starts. This story starts. One of our YouTube viewers who follows our channel reached out to me about selling a property he has that's in the Toronto area that is tenanted, and wanted some advice and help, of course, with doing that, which we did. Now, before I kind of get into the actual story, how this all kind of played out, because it's a bit interesting. I'm just going to unpack a little bit about some of the details of selling a tenant property in the Toronto area. I have a more detailed video, which I'll add the link to in the show notes for those of you who are interested. But at a high level, it's important to understand that when a landlord's selling a tenanted property in Ontario, provided it's past the lease term and the tenancy is month to month, the tenant, well, under no circumstances can the landlord evict a tenant. A landlord cannot evict a tenant because they want to sell the property. A landlord typically just needs to list the property for sale with the tenant. And if the buyer wants to move into the property for their own use, then they can add a clause in the agreement that says the seller will give the tenant notice, because that is basically one of the few ways you can evict a tenant. If either the owner wants to move into the property or the purchaser, when you're selling it, intends to move into the property. In that scenario, the tenant gets a notice called an N12 notice, which is a notice to end the tenancy for the purchaser or the landlord's own use, and they get 1 month's rent compensation in return. Now, these clauses were quite common. Before COVID, during COVID, even today, but during COVID, a lot of buyers became a little bit more reluctant to lean on these clauses because they were worried, well, what happens if the tenant doesn't move out? Because some tenants during COVID were just not moving out, partly because there's a health crisis, or the economy is crazy, the rental market is crazy. So landlord-tenant board was backed up. So some tenants were just basically saying, I don't care if you give me notice, I'm not moving out. And it's kind of around that time where, this kind of cash for keys became more common. And cash for keys basically involves the landlord kind of coming up with an agreement and negotiating with the tenant to have the tenant to agree to vacate the property. They sign an agreement to end the tenancy, which is a form called the N11. And in return for the tenant voluntarily agreeing to vacate, the landlord compensates them a certain amount of money. And that's kind of why they call it cash for keys. And that's a little bit more secure and kind of buyers are far more confident that if we have an agreement to end a tenancy, that the tenant will actually move out because they're voluntarily agreeing to end the tenancy versus just receiving notice, which in theory they can dispute with the landlord-tenant board if they think the notice isn't in good faith. So that's kind of a little bit of a background. So, when we get someone who reaches out to us about selling a property that's tenanted, the first question, of course, is the most likely buyer an investor? And if they are they going to want to keep the tenant? And if that is the case, then we just sell the property, list it with the tenant, and in those cases usually the buyer makes an offer and plans to assume the tenant, so the tenant never moves out. There's no cash for keys deal, there's none of that going on. And that's the ideal scenario. That's the easiest for everybody, all parties involved. But when we're selling a property where we think the ideal tenant is someone who intends to move into it, well, usually this issue of an N11 might come up. Some buyers might be more open to just giving the tenant the typical standard notice and the 1 month's rent compensation, but some buyers may prefer an agreement to end the tenancy, which requires kind of a cash or keys deal between the owner and the tenant. So typically in those situations, we kind of plant the seed before we even hit the market, see how open the tenant is to that, in the event that it comes up, so we're not scrambling trying to, figure out how to deal with this after the fact. And in this case, the tenant said they're not interested in discussing or planning or whatever, having an N11 sign. They just want to wait and see whatever buyer wants to make an offer. And if they're going to kind of, take it over themselves, that's fine. But they don't want to sign an N11, is effectively what they said. So we said that's fine. So we're just going to list it and wait for the right buyer. So we do get a buyer. They make an offer. They're prepared, and of course, as we expected, they want to move into it themselves. Even though they said to us they're prepared to make the offer with a clause that says that we're going to give the tenant the traditional N12 notice so that the buyer will move in with their own use and give them the 1 month's rent compensation. They would prefer if we negotiated with the tenant to sign the agreement to end the tenancy. The buyer would have been more confident. They don't have to worry about if the tenant doesn't move out. So we had this offer in hand. We went to the tenant and said, listen, this person said they're willing to make an offer with the N12, in which case you get only 1 month's rent compensation. But if you sign an N11, you'll get 20 grand. We thought it was a good deal. It's win-win. Everyone's happy. Tenant gets more money. My client's happy. The buyer's happy. It's truly a win-win scenario. And the tenant comes back with a very formally written email and says, nope, we want 50, which was a bit surprising. I was not expecting that. And it was a very interesting kind of email to get because, you know, you start thinking, well, how the heck did they come up with $50,000? I mean, it's not worth $50,000 for either the landlord or the seller or the buyer, that level of compensation. But, you know, part of me wonders, do people see things on Reddit? Do tenants see things on Facebook tenant groups about how one tenant squeezed $50,000 from their landlord and everyone else wants to? And maybe some tenants are. Maybe there are some landlords who either are desperate and needs to, or don't know any better and are getting, you know, squeezed and aren't negotiating properly. And maybe that is happening, but certainly wasn't something that we were kind of prepared to entertain. So we kind of ignored it basically and just started negotiating with the buyer. And now what was interesting was when we kind of went back to the buyer and said, well, no, the tenant's not interested in signing the agreement on the tenancy, the buyer starts getting cold feet now because, well, they're worried, even if they're prepared to give the sort of the typical notice for the purchaser's own use, now they're a little bit more worried that the tenant's not going to move out because the tenant seems like they're unwilling to cooperate. You know, and what seemed like almost like a done deal is kind of falling further apart. And I think this is where this business I find is very interesting, and kind of the whole negotiation process is interesting because, you know, what we have to try to do is try to bridge this gap between what our client wants and ideally what the purchaser wants, to see if there's like this sliver of a space where both people's interests are aligned. In that moment, it certainly didn't look like it. The buyer was kind of losing interest. So, you know, we had to basically kind of go back to them and understand, you know, what their concerns were. Are they concerned that the tenant's not going to move out? Are they concerned the tenant's not going to pay rent? And talking to paralegals to understand effectively what is the worst case scenario. And I think this is an important part of the negotiation process, is that we can think about the worst case scenario and we can put a dollar price to that worst case scenario, right? And we can potentially draft up an agreement that addresses the worst case scenario and basically says, well, if the worst happens to the buyer, the tenant doesn't move out, they don't pay the rent for X period of time, the seller will compensate X dollars to address this loss that the purchaser has effectively. So we can put a dollar price to it. And effectively, the negotiation agreement is basically seeing, is our client fine with the possibility that this worst case scenario might play out? Is the buyer fine if, you know, if the tenant doesn't move out, as long as they get compensated a certain amount from the seller to take into account this additional expense and headache of having a tenant not move out? And that's basically what we did. We kind of looked at the worst case scenario, find this middle ground, and basically said, okay, if this happens, this is how we're going to deal with it. This is what the cost, the max cost is. And the max cost was a little more than the 20, but not quite 50. So it's kind of a better situation, right, for both parties. And we kind of came to an agreement that worked for both parties. Now, you know, one question is, well, what if the max cost is still $50,000? Like, what if this is high price that maybe at first glance our seller doesn't even want to deal with? Or maybe they're considering dealing with it just to get it over with. You know, should they just negotiate with the tenant at that point and get it over with, or should they work with the buyer and negotiate with them with this $50,000 kind of worst case cost if the tenant refuses to move out and doesn't pay rent and all of those things. And if that's what the worst case scenario is, and if our client is fine with that risk that they might have to pay that in the worst possible event, then they're still going to most likely negotiate with the buyer rather than the tenant. Because the thing is, if you negotiate with the tenant, I mean, they're guaranteed to lose $50,000. Whereas if they craft some deal with the buyer where they only have to pay out $50,000 in the worst case scenario, well, you have to think about, well, what is the worst case scenario and what is the probability of that happening, right? And if even if the probability of this thing is 50%, well, it's still better to go negotiate with the buyer because they have a 50-50 chance of paying the 50 grand or paying nothing, right? So their expected outcome is significantly better if you're negotiating with the buyer rather than with a tenant, in this specific kind of worst case scenario where this cost and the tenant's expectations are unreasonable and the worst case scenario costs are very high. So it wasn't quite that high, but we did eventually negotiate an agreement. And we, like I said, we found some middle ground between what the buyer wanted and what addressed the seller's concerns. And we came to an agreement and we signed all the paperwork. They did the inspection. And we effectively gave the tenant the N12 notice, gave them their 1 month's rent that they're allowed in terms of compensation, gave them the adequate period of time. Of course, throughout this, and we always recommend both parties, and in particular our client's party, having their own paralegal to kind of negotiate this process for them. And we had Rochelle from Landlord Rescues, great, kind of do that for them. And they got the notice. And I mean, the interesting thing is, of course, by the end of it, when the period came where they needed to vacate, I mean, the tenants just moved out as they're supposed to, and effectively we're just left with 1 month's rent compensation rather than, $20,000. And which is, again, an interesting scenario. I mean, one person might ask, well, why didn't we do that? I mean, it actually worked out way better for the seller and for the buyer financially. So one person's question might be, well, why the heck didn't we do that from the beginning? I mean, and the answer is because these are very sometimes hard things to negotiate. And quite frankly, we don't know how they're going to play out. And that's why I said the original offer of compensating the tenant $20,000 was like a win-win for everybody. It was easy. Everyone was fine with that level of compensation, except for the tenant. They wanted way more money, right? Because they hadn't thought about, well, what happens if I'm not bluffing or we're not bluffing and they only get an N12 and just get 1 month's rent? So that would have been still the better scenario because we didn't know what the tenant was going to do. If the tenant kind of didn't move out, it could have cost our client more money, right? So you try to go for the optimal situation that is a middle ground between both parties. And some of this middle ground a lot of times is, I mean, us dealing with our own clients to, sometimes our clients who just don't want to compensate the tenant anything out of principle. And, we have to nudge them up and say, listen, these are the laws, this is what's reasonable, and try to find some middle ground between them. But when one party, in this case, the tenant, is asking for something that is beyond reasonable, at least from our perspective, you have to find another way to negotiate the deal and another way that is, at least in our situation, because we're representing the landlord or the owner, a bit more favorable to our client's interests. And of course, we did that in this situation. Now, I think I'll wrap up by kind of highlighting a couple of lessons, I think, for both for landlords and for tenants. For landlords, I think, one thing is just to be mindful of when you should and when you should and shouldn't worry about a cash or keys deal. Like I said, in some situations, the best way is just to sell it tenanted, and that's who the buyer is going to most likely be. But even when you're in these situations where you're in trying to deal with like a difficult tenant who refuses to sign an N11 and they want a ton of money, our job is to try to bridge the gap then with the buyer. And that's what we have to do in this case. The buyer who is reluctant to give sort of the traditional notice for their own use, we had to listen to their concerns, understand them in detail, put a price to them, and then try to bridge this gap. And of course, we can't always do that. Some people just are not interested. Some people get frustrated, but this person really wanted the house. So we had to kind of listen to them, understand them, and kind of craft up terms that addressed both parties' needs. And I think that's the important thing in these situations, just because, you know, the tenant says, I want 50, which is unreasonable. And then the buyer says, well, now I'm not interested because I really want the agreement to end up tenancy. You don't just let it die. You try to find some middle ground. You try to understand people's concerns. And in this case, the buyer was more willing to negotiate than the tenant. You know, that's why we went down that road. They seem more willing and eager to kind of make a deal than the tenant. The tenant just wanted to hold the landlord hostage, which wasn't a smart move in the end. You know, and I think the lessons for tenants are like, if you really want to be that aggressive and kind of play poker basically in these situations, and this is a very specific situation where we had an offer and potential terms, you have to be thinking about what are the different outcomes and the odds of success and the probability of different outcomes. Because in this case, like I said, the tenants were really just gambling on the fact that I'm bluffing and lying and would be desperate and needs to give them $50,000 to sign the agreement to end the tenancy, which isn't the case. So, you want to be thinking about your different scenarios. You want to think about who you're negotiating with. I mean, I think that's very important. I mean, if they Googled me, am I like a second year realtor who they think doesn't understand the business, or are they dealing with someone who kind of understands a little bit more, who's not going to be duped into and get rattled by a certain situation where tenants demanding a ton of money? And I think that is the case. Sometimes some tenants, some agents, some sellers just get rattled and kind of, bow down to certain situations because they think they don't have options when sometimes they really do, and they just hadn't considered them. So if you're in a tenant in that situation, I think you have to be cautious because, again, it's unfortunate these tenants walked away from what's effectively, I don't know, close to 17 grand between the difference between what we offered and the 1 month that they got. Worked out well for our clients, but again, it was a little bit more stressful for all parties involved. And we're lucky it worked out better for our clients and the buyers. But like I said, in the ideal world, everyone would have been happier earlier if we just kind of had the $20,000 deal. Tenant would have made a little bit more money, would have helped them with their move. But they were a little bit too aggressive in their negotiating strategy. And I think if you are that aggressive, you just have to be prepared that you just kind of get nothing in the end, or just get the 1 month's rent. So that's a little bit about kind of what I thought was an interesting story, an interesting scenario. If you have questions about it, please post them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. Until next time.